I'm in Union Square, and behind me is what some call Andy Warhol's second factory, but the artist simply called it his office. But in June 1968, something terrible happened here. Writer Valerie Solanas pulled out a gun and shot Andy Warhol. For Inside Edition Digital, I'm Sal Bono, and this is New York Gritty.
Andy Warhol is possibly the greatest artist of all time. He redefined what art is. He not only elevated drag and trans personalities to the realm of superstar, he changed what cinema can be, what art can be. He took American capitalism and consumerism and spat it back in your face by doing Campbell soup art, and he made a fortune while doing it.
In early 1961, he really turned himself into one of the new pop artists of that moment. He had a big hand in creating the movement known as pop art, where artists took everyday objects made commercially, and presented them as the subject of fine art. And that's really his discovery.
And at the same time, he conquered every medium there is and was a very inspiring person on the scene. Just having him in our midst was like having some great messiah or, wonderful shaman who seemed to know everything and was clued in, and we turned to for guidance. We turned to him for validation.
Warhol was from the working-class, blue-collar city of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Pittsburgh, steel capital of the world.
And had his sights on a bigger world than the one his immigrant parents raised him in.
Andy Warhol arrived in New York in 1949, wanting to be a fine artist, but having to make a living as a commercial illustrator. And in the 1950s, that's really mostly what he did. He did have solo shows as an artist, but mostly he made these cutesy pie camp illustrations for things like women's shoes.
During Andy Warhol's rise in the art world, he gained attention through the company he kept and lavish parties he threw at the first factory in Midtown Manhattan. As you can see now, it's a parking garage.
The thing about the factory is that you look at the roster of people that would go there. It'd be everybody from Mick Jagger and Lou Reed to Candy Darling and Nico. He had a wide range of folks that were in and about New York City from the late 60s and 70s. How exclusive was it to get into the factory or be a member of it?
Everybody wanted to get into the factory, and some of them were people that were working directly with Andy. Some of them were just stars that would kind of drop by, and some of them wanted to be loved by Andy and wanted to be stars.
One of those people who wanted in Warhol's world was a woman named Valerie Solanas. Solanas grew up in New Jersey and had a traumatic upbringing. She claimed she was sexually assaulted by her father at a young age. Her grandfather also physically abused her, according to reports. Even her stepfather was reportedly not kind to her. When she was 15, she left home and got pregnant. She would have 2 children, a girl and later a boy, whom she had to give up.
Her daughter, her first child, was raised, so she was sort of sent away to have the baby, and then she was raised as her sister. In terms of her son, as far as I know, there was no contact. According to what the son told me, there was no contact after he was put up for adoption, right? So there was a few years where she would go and visit him when he was a baby, but after that, there was no contact at all.
Solanas was highly intelligent and got a degree in psychology from the University of Maryland. She attended the University of Minnesota's Graduate School of Psychology before dropping out and moving to attend Berkeley for a few courses. It was during this time that she came out as a lesbian and began writing what she called the Scum Manifesto. Scum stood for Society for Cutting Up Men. Solanas also had mental illness.
Here's a very bright, very ambitious, she sort of sticks out like a sore thumb from the pearl clutching kind of, the 50s and 60s women that she's, are her contemporaries.
Solanas arrived in New York City in 1962.
This bohemian New York City scene where she's, finally in a place where she gets to sort of be openly bisexual, openly lesbian, openly whatever she wants.
Solanas eventually moved here to the Chelsea Hotel. It looks a bit different now, but for generations, it was home to writers, artists, musicians, and others who didn't quite fit into mainstream society. While living here, Solanas performed odd jobs and did sex work while trying to pursue her career as a writer.
The Scum Manifesto, which involved kind of overturning capitalism, getting rid of everything, especially men. She just wanted men to be eliminated from the populace. People said, oh, she's kidding, it's a satire. She said, no, I'm not.
So the Scum Manifesto was a revolutionary, radical manifesto written by Solanas and finally published in 1967. She wrote and obsessively revised it between 1965 and 67. Initially, she self-published the document and sold mimeographed copies to men for $2.50, but women could have it for $1, which I think just sums up, the philosophy of Valerie Solanas right there.
While living at the Chelsea, she met publisher Maurice Girodias.
So she signed a contract with Girodias to publish Scum Manifesto, but as her paranoia worsened, she eventually kind of misinterpreted the document and the contract and feared that she had signed away the rights to her future writings as well. So she developed this theory that he and Warhol were both conspiring to steal her work, but in reality, the two men, they barely knew one another.
It was during this time that she also met Andy Warhol.
Valerie Solanas was a bit player in Andy Warhol's factory universe, but she formally meets him at the factory in 1967, and he casts her in one of his films called I Am Man, and only pays her $25 for the role. Why that's so interesting is because he does that because he loses her script, which, as the story goes, Valerie Solanas repeatedly tried to get Andy Warhol to produce a gender-bending play that she had written called Up Your Ass. He accepted the script for review, then told Solanas it was well typed, and jokingly offered her a job at the factory as a typist. So when she later contacted Warhol about the script, she was told that he had lost it. And he did lose it. Warhol, was a collector. Everything that came across his desk, he kept, as evidenced in his 610 time capsules that we have here at the museum. But the museum did find the original script in Warhol's belongings many years later. She believed that he was plotting to steal her intellectual property.
In early 1968, Warhol moved out of the factory in Midtown and into an office here in Union Square. Many still called it the factory.
In the 60s, America was in tumult. There was a lot of rage in the air, along with the hippy-dippy love fest that was encounter to that. And there were assassinations left and right. Things seemed to be helter-skelter and out of control. And it kind of set the seed for Valerie Solanas, for somebody that unhinged, to kind of claim center stage in such a dark, dangerous way.
It was also during this time that Solanas would not give up her goal of having Warhol produce her play. As he continued to dismiss her, she took matters into her own hands. On June 3rd, 1968, Solanas was outside the office waiting for Warhol.
They go up in the elevator together. They talk for a few minutes in the elevator, then things seem to settle down. There's some other Warhol helpers, Warhol staff members who are there, and they're talking with Valerie, and all of a sudden, she pulls out a gun and starts shooting for no real reason. I mean, she misses a few times, and then eventually Warhol falls to the ground, cowering. He smashes into a desk, smashes his head, and eventually she comes right up, presses the gun against his side, just under his armpit, and shoots. The bullet pierces all sorts of organs.
Solanas also shot London art critic Mario Amaya, who also happened to be in the office that day. A bullet grazed his back and was discharged from the hospital later that day.
She also aimed the gun at Fred Hughes, Warhol's business manager, who pled for his life just as the elevators open and Solanas flees the scene of the crime and rides down the elevator. So you couldn't get any more cinematic than that. So with only a single bullet of the 5 that she fired, entered Warhol's body.
3 hours after the shooting, Solanas surrendered to police near Times Square, telling a cop Warhol had, quote, "too much control over my life." Warhol arrived at the hospital clinically dead, but survived thanks to life-saving surgery.
He spent 2 months in the hospital recuperating from surgeries to repair his damaged lungs, esophagus, spleen, liver, stomach, and his injuries were so severe that he had to wear a surgical corset for the rest of his life.
Warhol didn't press any charges against Solanas.
He would say, well, how can I press charges against her if she was just acting according to her nature? If it's just kind of who she is, like she shoots people. That's a really weird thing to do. That's a very strange justification, but also kind of true, right? Like, this is a true thing. Then Warhol, for all of his limitations, had this ability to take people for who they were and like truly allow them to be extremely weird or eccentric or even violent.
Appearing before a judge, Solanas said what she did to Warhol was, quote, a moral act, and I consider it immoral that I missed. I should have done target practice. Solanas was charged with attempted murder, assault, and illegal possession of a gun. She was later declared mentally unstable and a paranoid schizophrenic, and remained in psychiatric custody. Months after the shooting, the Scum Manifesto was officially published by Gerodius and his company Olympia. In June 1969, a year after the shooting, Solanas was deemed competent and able to stand trial. Refusing an attorney, she represented herself and pleaded guilty to reckless assault with intent to harm. She was sentenced to 3 years in prison, with 1 year of time served.
When Andy would show off the scars, the photographs of them, was he himself, in a weird way, turning himself into an art piece?
He had this amazing, torso full of scars. Why not show those off? Why not to show that he was the guy who famously had been shot by Valerie Solanas and almost died? That was all part of a myth that he could create for himself.
Even in prison, Valerie Solanas tried to get in touch with Warhol in a series of letters.
And, she would write him letters like, Dear Toad, and, these hilarious, hateful, strange sort of letters.
Nicole Desolon of the Andy Warhol Museum read to me some of the letters Solanas wrote to Warhol.
I no longer feel any hostility towards you or anyone else. I feel at peace with the world, and I feel now that the manifesto has been published, and now that with all the publicity, I have a chance to earn money without being dependent on men. And I'm in a much better position than I was to deal with you, Gerodius, and all the other vultures that I encountered. I'm very happy you're alive and well. As for all of your barbarianism, you're still the best person to make movies with. And if you treat me fairly, I'd like to work with you.
Solanas was released from prison in 1971 and continued to stalk Andy Warhol.
The shooting mercifully did not end Andy's life, but it did alter it irrevocably because he was nervous and afraid ever since that happened, that it could happen again. And if he ever saw someone that reminded him even vaguely of Valerie, he was wary of them. He was terrified of another Valerie Solanas. Andy was a public figure. He depended on going out, meeting people in restaurants, going to nightclubs. He was always wary from that point on to try to prevent another shooting, because it certainly could have happened again with another crackpot.
By the mid-1970s, Solanas was out of prison and found herself homeless in New York City. She had a number of breakdowns and mental health episodes. She moved around and lived in various parts of the country and began writing again, publishing what she believed was the purest form of the Scum Manifesto.
She becomes completely consumed with the paranoid ideation that her uterus has a uterine transmitter that's communicating messages to the mob. At one point, she tries to dig that transmitter out of her body with a fork. It was really violent, terrible, disintegration of the self. And she ends up, in San Francisco, living in a single occupancy hotel, one of those like little welfare hotels that they had at the time. And she, sort of gets into drugs and is prostituting again, just all this kind of stuff, right? And it's a really tragic end, because she kind of goes from this high point at the late 70s of finally getting the version of the Scum Manifesto that she was most proud of. And then it sort of really falls apart, and we don't really see her recover after that.
Following the shooting, Warhol had a fear of hospitals and continued to face a series of health problems as a result of the June 1968 incident.
We'll never really know exactly the immediate cause of Andy Warhol's heart stopping, right, in February of 1987. But, his body had been damaged by the shooting. There's no doubt about that. And he, for a while at least, is taking speed every day. He's addicted to, or he takes a lot of Valium. He's on downers, he's on uppers, he's part of the party scene. None of that's great for your body.
Warhol suffered from an infected gallbladder and wanted to cure himself holistically. However, it got so bad that despite his fear of hospitals, he went under the knife in February 1987 for gallbladder surgery.
So it's not an easy operation. What people call a routine gallbladder operation that Andy underwent in 1987 wasn't really routine at all. It was tricky. It wasn't beyond the skills of this very talented surgeon, but it wasn't straightforward at all. Andy had simply let his illness go too long. His gallbladder was too rotten. There was too much infection. Somewhere around 4 o'clock in the morning, his heart stopped. They tried to revive him. They tried again and again. They did find his heartbeat again, I think 2 times. They did CPR. They injected him full of all sorts of emergency drugs to bring him back to life. But in the end, frankly, his heart just stopped.
Andy Warhol died February 21st, 1987. He was 58. Some say his death was a result of the shooting.
The man who turned a soup can into art is dead. Guru of pop art has died in New York.
I actually wrote a cover story of the Village Voice called The Death of Downtown. And one of the impetuses for that was not only that the clubs were kind of tired or closing, but our leader was gone. He was the leader of the scene. He was the leader of the nightlife scene, the art scenes, the magazines, everything. They still have Andy Warhol's interview, but without Andy Warhol, it's like Fashion Police without Joan Rivers. Like it doesn't really count. There are maybe 4 people that I met through the years as a celebrity columnist that thrilled me beyond belief, and that was Diana Ross, Cher, David Bowie, and Andy Warhol. He really was like the unofficial mayor of New York.
Solanas was told the news by a friend and former Factory alum, Ultraviolet.
Ultraviolet calls Valerie Solanas and says, "Did you hear the news about Andy Warhol?" And Valerie had not heard, and was kind of like, the reaction was basically like, "Oh, he died? Yeah, let me ask you some questions about the copyright for this guy manifesto. How do I get to the Library of Congress and get the copyright?" Like, she just doesn't register hardly at all as significant.
Just over a year after Andy Warhol's death, Valerie Solanas died of pneumonia at the Bristol Hotel in San Francisco, where she was living in squalor. She was 52. The incident between Solanas and Warhol has been referenced many times over the years in pop culture. A year after the shooting, Lou Reed wrote a song to cheer up his mentor and close friend called Andy's Chest.
And stones are all erupting out for you. And all the cheap blood suckers are flying after you.
Later in 1990, Lou Reed and John Cale released I Believe.
Valerie Solanas took the elevator, got off at the 4th floor. She pointed the gun at Andy saying, "You cannot control me anymore."
Solanas' story was told in the acclaimed 1996 film I Shot Andy Warhol.
Yeah, he had too much control over my life.
Where she was portrayed by Lily Taylor. In 2017, Lena Dunham played Solanas in an episode of American Horror Story, Cult.
Because you can't stand to have a woman succeed.
Oh, Valerie, women can't be serious artists.
When you boil it down, the simplicity of it is gun control and mental health. What does it tell you that all these years later, all these decades later, we're still having that same conversation? And women's rights. So it's 3 things. And we're still having that conversation, those conversations.
Well, and we haven't dealt with that. We don't deal well with gun control. We definitely do not deal well with mental health and what are the needs of people, who are struggling, especially with paranoid ideations and things like that. We don't deal well with that. We have no real meaningful way to deal with women's rage and the righteousness of women's rage, especially. That like people living in the world as a woman can be very difficult and even traumatic, especially for certain women in certain conditions.
Well, Andy always felt everyone on Earth will ultimately have their own TV show and be famous for 15 minutes. Tragically enough, Valerie Solanas became famous as a result of shooting Andy Warhol, but it also made him more famous in a way he didn't want. It did generate a lot of publicity, but it's not the kind of publicity he relished. He wanted things to be happy. He loved gossip. He liked being a bitchy queen, believe me. But that's about as mean as he got.